Hey guys, welcome to my channel Coding Shinobi again. This is part 6 of Java interview question series where today we are going to cover about Java exceptions and we are going to see about interview questions all around Java exceptions. After this video, I hope you'll be able to tackle or answer all the questions around Java exceptions. So let's get started.
Remember, guys, consistency is the key to success. Stay consistent, you are on the right track. All the best. So, let's move to Java exception handling interview questions. First and basic question is, what is an exception in Java? Exception is nothing but an abnormal event that disrupts the flow of normal program execution that, unless handled, could lead to termination of program. It will, if not handled, it will terminate the program abruptly, and you don't want to do that on production, right? So program could run into exception if it tries to access a file that does not exist, trying to access an index in an array which is not within the size of an array, which is also known as index out of bound. It's actually array index out of bounds exception. Sorry guys, my fault. And file is not found, like file not found exception, and etc. What is the difference between class not found exception and no class def error? As the exception name suggests, class not found exception means like class is not found, right? So both these exceptions occur when a class loader or JVM is unable to find classes while loading during runtime. However, the difference between these two are class not found exception occurs when we try to load a class that is not found in the class path at runtime by making the use of the load class or class.forName methods. But no class definition def error occurs when class is present at the compile time but was not found during runtime. If you guys have used Spring Boot applications and you are trying to upgrade the guys with some experience with around Spring frameworks, they might have gotten this error or this exception often when you are trying to update your Spring versions. Sometimes the jar files are not loaded properly. They can be found at compile time but not at the runtime, and you can see these errors occurring in your programs or in your application. Let's move on to the next question. How are the keywords final, finally, and finalize different from each other? So final keyword is used to make a variable, a method, or a class, a constant, you can say. If you are prepending final to a variable name, then its value cannot be changed once it is assigned and is treated as constant. If you try to change the value of the final variable, it will throw an compile time error. Final method, it cannot be overridden. If you are trying to override a final method in your subclass, of course, a compile time error will be thrown. Final class cannot be inherited. If you don't want your class to be inherited by any class or don't want your class to have subclasses then or child classes, then you should make your class final. The final is used when exception handling, when you want to execute a code irrespective of whether exception occurs or not. There are some things you want to do even when the exception occurs or not, like you are opening a file in the try block and you definitely want to close the file object if you are if even if the exception occurs or not. So you can use finally block to close your resources. Usually that is the purpose of finally block, or developers use for that purpose. The most common purpose of finally block, you can say. And then finalize, it is a method called by garbage collector just before destroying the objects no longer needed in the program. When the purpose of object is served, there is a daemon process which executes this finalize method from time to time to collect these objects and free the memory space. So that's how finalize method is used. What are the advantages of using exception handling? So as you know, exceptions terminates the program flow. It might terminate your application. You are running an application for like 1,000 users or million users. Um, one of the user inputs a wrong input, like you are expecting a text and it inputs a number, or you are expecting a number, he inputs a text. At that time, you don't want your application to throw the error, right? Instead, you will just throw the exception back to the user, saying that please enter the valid input, right? You don't want to show user like what is happening in your application or detailed track trace of your application, right? So instead of program getting terminated, handle the exception with proper procedure or return the instruction message to user. In turn, exception handling has following advantages: provision to complete program execution, so your program is not terminated abruptly; easy identification of program code and error handling code; propagation of errors, meaningful error reporting, identifying error types. You catch the exception, you do whatever you need to do there, or if you want to return the message to the user, do it in a simple, understandable, user readable, user friendly message. Or if you want your code flow to be different, you can do that in your catch blocks and etc. So basic advantage of exception handling is like it will stop your program from terminating, and in it can be used in proper debugging of your application. What are the types of exceptions in Java? Explain in brief. There are mainly two types of exceptions in Java. One is checked exception and another is unchecked exception. What are checked exceptions? Checked exceptions are checked at compile time. If you are not handling your checked exceptions at the compiler will throw an error. So exception must be handled using try catch block or throws keyword. And it is a direct subclass of exception class. It is, for example, IO exception or file not found exception. These, when you are trying to open a file object and you are not, and the file is not found, so you need to handle it explicitly. And if you don't handle it, then compiler will not even compile. It will throw an error. Your program your program does not get compiled. And unchecked exceptions are runtime exceptions. They are not caught in compilation. It is a direct subclass of runtime exception class. Arithmetic exception, which can be thrown when you are trying to divide a number by zero. Array index out of bounds exception when you are trying to access an index which is out of bounds of the array or not within the size of the array. Checked exception example, you can see if we are trying to load a file from this particular path and we are not handling an exception, so file reader throws file not found exception and buffer reader throws IO exception. So you need to handle both of these exceptions uh, before compilation. And then unchecked exception, yet I have assigned value of x to be 0, y is equal to 10, and you are trying to divide y by 0. So since we are this is in mathematically incorrect, program doesn't know, like programmatically this is correct, right? The syntax is and everything is, so how compiler will know like this is going to throw an divide by 0 error. So this might lead to arithmetic exception, which is an unchecked exception. So your program compiles fine if there is going to be an unchecked exception, but it won't compile if there are any checked exceptions in your application. Can we write try block without a catch or finally block? No, it will lead to an compilation error. Try should be coupled with both or either one of them. It could be either try catch block or try finally block, but you cannot write only try block. It will lead to an compilation error. Will the finally block be executed if either of the try or catch blocks return the control? Means like you are returning the control from try or catch blocks without even reaching to finally block. So yes, finally block will always execute no matter the control is getting written from try or catch blocks itself. The written statements in try or catch blocks are masked by the finally. The control will just, the program will just ignore your return statements in try or catch blocks and it will go to the finally blocks. Right, finally block. What is the difference between throw, throws, and throwable in Java? The throw keyword is used to throw an exception. You can throw a custom exception using a throw keyword. For example, you're catching an exception in your catch block, but you just want to throw a custom exception, which is which has user friendly message, then you can just go for custom exception. Throws is a keyword used in message signature to declare this method that this method may throw exceptions, and it is used in exception handling. Of course, there are two ways you can handle an exception, right guys? First one is throws keyword, and second is try catch block. So throws is one of the methods wherein you can use it to handle your exception, or tell the compiler that this method might throw an exception in future. So throwable is a keyword for superclass where all exceptions and errors are the types of throwable. Like all the exceptions and errors, whatever you have, they are the it is the throwable is the superclass of those exceptions and errors. And you can use it to throw a custom exception, like class exception extends throwable. This is how it is in Java. Next question. What happens if there are statements after finally block and the control returns from the finally block itself? Okay, as you know guys, finally block executes finally in the program as its name suggests. So it will give you an unreachable code error. Compiler will ignore the statements after the finally block as control will return from the finally block itself. So your code will not get compiled. Don't get fooled that your code will return from the finally block and it will just ignore. But the compiler also gives you an error. What do you know about try with resources block? This is one of the most common questions because it was introduced in Java 1.7 or 8. I'm not sure. You have to look into it. And it is used to replace try catch finally block. If you are declaring one or more resources, try with resources ensures that each of them is closed at the end of the statement execution of the block. Resources declared need to implement auto closable interface. So we'll see what resources and how to close it and how we close it in try catch finally block. So this is how a typical try catch finally block looks like. Like I have declared a variable of scanner object, and scanner object is trying to access a file, a test.txt. Okay, we are catching this exception if the file is not found, and finally if scanner is not equal to null, then scanner.close. So here whenever we are trying to get to the finally block, we are explicitly closing the scanner object. And the try with resources will make sure that at the end of this flow execution the scanner object is closed. See, if you want to have multiple resources for your try catch blocks, then you can just add a semicolon to the first statement after first statement, and the scope of these variables are limited to only try block. And after the execution is completed, these objects are automatically closed by JVM. So these resources, scanner, print writer, they need to implement auto closable interface. Now, what is a stack trace and how it related to an exception? So you guys might have written e.print stack trace in your programs, right? So stack trace is information about all the classes and methods that were invoked from the start of execution, like from your main method maybe to the point where the exception occurred. So it will contain all the methods that the call came in from, starting from the main method to where the exception occurred, so that it will be useful for you to debug the root cause of the exception and where exactly the exception occurred. For example, if you look at this stack trace, you are getting a null pointer exception at book.getBookTitle on line number 26. So this way you can go and see like what null object you are trying to access on these lines. You should start looking from the top of the exception. So most probably the exception lies in the first two lines of the exceptions only, most probably. And you can see it is going till the main. The stack trace is going to the main since your application started your execution from main method. Okay. Now what is exception propagation in Java? If the exception is not handled in the current method, it will be propagated to the preceding method. If that method does not handle the exception will be needed to be handled by the previous method. If it is not handled in between from the main method to your current method, then exception propagates to the bottom of the call stack, that is your main method. And if it is not still handled in the main method, the program terminates. And you don't want that. So you must handle the exception in the current method itself so that it is not propagated to the bottom of the call stack. Okay. What are the some best practices to be followed when dealing with exceptions in Java? This you should know, and maybe if you are interviewing as an experienced candidate, then you might get this question. So you don't have to remember everything, but 3 to 4 points would do. So avoid using generic exception class, right? Use specific exception handling classes for better debugging. Use multiple catch blocks if more than one exception. And if you're using more generic exception class, then it should be at the bottom of the catch block of that exception should be at the bottommost, so that specific exceptions are cached in the first catch blocks itself. Throw exceptions early in the program, fail fast approach in development. Make good use of try with resources to close the resources properly. If you are using try catch finally, maybe you might forget to close the resources, right? Like scanner, the file, you have opened a file, you did not close the file, or a reader, whatever it is. Use try with resources so you don't have to do the extra work. Always log the exceptions with meaningful messages so that you can know like what how the exception occurred, and it could be used for easy debugging. Make sure you use custom exceptions with meaningful messages if there is no exception matching your requirement in Java library. When creating custom exception, append exception in the end of the name so that you or the developer who is going to develop on on your code should know like this is an exception and it is a commonly used convention. Whenever your method throws an exception, it is an document using javadoc with @throws parameter. It's good to document, right? So that if you leave the organization, the next developer might know like why you are throwing this exception. Throw exception only when it makes sense because exceptions are costly. So if your requirement is in the Java library, if your requirement is present in the Java library, then you don't need to throw any custom exception. Only throw it if it makes sense. Yeah, in this scenario, the finally block does not get executed. This I have seen, like I have given interviews for multiple companies, you can say 10, 20 companies, I'm not sure, but I have been asked these questions for almost 60% of the time. Like, finally blocks are meant to be executed no matter what. That's what we have seen, right? But in one scenario, if you write system.exit in either of the try or catch block, finally block does not get executed because the system.exit terminates the running JVM. Then what happens to the exception object after the exception handling is complete? What happens, guys? The object is garbage collected. Is it possible to throw exceptions from a static block? No, it does not make any sense to throw exceptions from a static block because static blocks are executed at the time of compile. So no method invokes it. You don't have any call stack, and no stack trace can be provided, and makes no sense to rethrow exception. Although you can use try catch block in static block, but without throw keyword. Explain Java exception hierarchy. So exceptions in Java are hierarchical and follow inheritance to categorize different kinds of exception. Right? Throwable extends object class, but throwable is categorized into exceptions and error. Error are those abnormal failures that are not in the scope of recovery of the application, like out of memory error or class def error, class not found def error. I guess that was it. It is not possible to anticipate errors or recover from them. The error could be due to failures in hardware, out of memory, JVM crash, etc. Virtual machine error, assertion error, etc. An exception is further divided into two categories: checked exceptions and unchecked exceptions. We already have seen like what are checked and unchecked exceptions, but checked exceptions are checked at compile time, and unchecked exceptions cannot be caught at the time of compilation. Some examples of checked exceptions are IO exception, and for runtime exceptions, it could be null pointer exception, arithmetic exception, etc.
So guys, this was all about interview questions around exception handling in Java. After this video, I hope you'll be able to answer the questions related to Java exceptions. And if you do like the content of this video, then make sure you subscribe and share this video as much as possible and help your friends. Till then, bye bye. See ya. See you in the next video.